Good morning, you guys. Hope everybody's doing all right. So I think I've got everybody. Oh wait, there's more. Taking attendance as I go. Okay. There's Mel. All right, that is almost everybody in class. So, oh wait. There's. Okay, thanks. Good morning. Um, all right. So test two is graded. I believe they're all graded. And they were some good, some less than great. It is an experiment for me as far as giving a test in that way. I'm using a Respondus lockdown browser is not always an option with testing from home. The benefit of that in a classroom setting is that you can, make sure nobody opens up a window to look up the answers, that sort of thing. If you're at home, I'm sure you have a cell phone that is not your computer, or a computer that is not your cell phone, or your roommate or your brother or cousin does. So nothing is there to kind of keep you from looking up the answers. Um, it seemed, well, some of you I can tell did not look up the answers, which is great and honest. It seemed some of you may have, kind of done some research during test time, which is not, generally speaking, okay or a good thing to do. I didn't penalize anyone for that this time. Um, it is what it is. It's the nature of the sort of class that we're currently in. But I'm trying to format the questions in a way that makes it based on stuff that you already know, not on, kind of stuff you can look up. So for the future, if you have great sections of knowledge that we did not cover in class, that's a little suspicious, just so you know. I know what we go over. I know what the class notes say. I know what the study guide says. If you are so motivated beforehand that you do a ton of research and know everything there is to know about these artists that we did not cover, that's great. But generally speaking, that's not the case. So for the tests that we've got coming up, don't look up the answers on Google or anything else. It sticks out if there is that the hint of that, right? I can't prove it, but you know what I'm saying. So I'll try and format the next one in a way that makes it a little more based on stuff that you already know from going over the information in class. Any questions on the test? Okay, I will try to format in the future having the images built in. That would be a benefit. I'm still working on that. Next test is over chapters 17 and 18, and we're really in the midst of chapter 18 now. So that will be a little bit. Um, what I want to go over today is the rest of what I have listed as chapter 18, part 1. So if you go to chapter notes here, and you guys can see my screen, I hope, then chapter 18 is a long chapter. I mean, it covers a lot of information. So there's a link to Google Docs for chapter 18. That is what I tend to put up to teach off of. And then I've got chapter 18, part 2, which is kind of where the break is for modernism. Subject matter wise, it's a break. So I don't know that we'll get into that today. We'll kind of see, but we'll finish up chapter 18, part 1. And also, you may have noticed my order of chapter 18 is somewhat different from the textbook order. I went ahead and, well, the book has Pre-Raphaelites and Ruskin kind of early on in the chapter. I did make a video for that, which is here. And you guys, for these videos that are on YouTube, this one has had 4 views, so that is about half of you. This is effectively the lecture. So, if you can totally get by just on reading, then maybe that's okay. But this is me emphasizing the stuff that I think needs to be emphasized, the stuff that you need to know from that text. So, for the lectures that I'm putting on D2L, that's kind of like the second half of the class that we're just not covering in the Zoom meeting. The Zoom meetings are going to be a little bit shorter than a normal class period, just so you're not here staring at your screen straight for an hour and 15 minutes with me talking. But there are other things that we don't get to cover. So I'm putting those there so that you can kind of go over them at your own speed, that sort of thing. So under chapter notes, there is loading more. Romantic landscape lecture, photography lecture, and these are mini lectures. They are 10 to 15 minutes for the most part. Some of them are a little bit longer than that. So there's romantic landscape, photography, realism versus the academy, which is a significant one. Then the pre-Raphaelites, Ruskin, and Whistler. So if you haven't seen these, give them some time. Go over those, because that is effectively me doing what we do in a Zoom meeting for those sections. Otherwise, I'm kind of hitting the high points. All right, and so what I want to go over today, and I'll leave that there. The late 19th century art in America and the Impressionists, and these are two very, very different things. The book has the art in America kind of a little bit before. The Impressionists are the more major, important section, but I do want to let you know, since we are Americans in the United States, what art was doing here. It kind of lagged stylistically behind the art of Paris, as every other place did. America was, as far as Europe was concerned, kind of a cultural backwater for a long time. So the art currents and trends that happened here were always kind of following in the wake of what happened in Europe. And Paris was the center of the art world from the time of the French Revolution going forward. That is where art changed the most. As the audience changed, the art changed to fit that new situation. But we do have some really, really great artists from the United States during this time. Some of them you may have heard of if you have just a kind of a passing interest in art history before this class. Winslow Homer is one of the best known, and this is his Snap the Whip. Homer is a painter who is a realistic painter. He paints daily life for the most part, and this shows kids at play. The style is basically realism. It looks nostalgic to us today because, it's a very old painting. But this was, for its time period, in keeping with the way that people dressed, in keeping with the games that children played, that sort of thing. So he's got a direct sense of light and shadow. Things are painted realistically. These are sort of visual stories that the audience can latch onto and identify with. And that is Homer's Snap the Whip. Move this a little bit from there. All right. This is his Lifeline, which is a little more dramatic. And this is someone, I believe this is from Niagara Falls, but I'm not positive, that had to be picked up right from the water, and this is the way that they got her out of the water. So I think this is from Niagara Falls, but I'm not positive. That is kind of Homer's region anyway. So this is realism. This is, of course, dramatic emphasis on the water that is there, the churning oceans or lake, as it may be. And it has a little bit of sort of romanticism tied into it. So those same sorts of currents work in the United States as well. So I can move this thing anywhere. There we go. That's what I want. All right. Should have figured that out days ago. The most well-known, or maybe not the most well-known, one of the most influential painters of this time period is Thomas Eakins. And Thomas Eakins is so influential because he was an art teacher who challenged the way that art was taught. And the changes that Eakins made in his own classes and the ones that he ultimately got in trouble for are basically the way that we teach art today. So he was just kind of an early adapter of treating males and females equally in an art classroom. He was one who insisted on studying the actual body rather than plaster cast, which was the tradition at that time. If you go to a drawing class at an art school, art school, right, that is what they teach, or a place with a larger program with figure drawing, then you draw the nude model every day in figure drawing class. And that is just the way that it's done. It's what I did at University of Georgia, Georgia State, same thing. Once you are past, kind of a beginning drawing class or two, there's a lot of emphasis on the figure because people tend to like to draw people in their pictures. So the best way to do that is to study the real thing, not a plaster cast of an ancient sculpture. And Eakins' emphasis on the figure was considered scandalous. He also allowed female students into his classes and taught them as males, which was deemed to be kind of crossing boundaries at the time. So he was kicked out of at least one art school as a faculty member. He taught in Pennsylvania primarily at three major schools. Philadelphia Academy of Art was one. And today, the kind of the foundation that Thomas Eakins laid is the foundation for the way that art is taught in schools and colleges and universities. He was just a little ahead of his time, and he is a realist painter. So I've been talking about Eakins. Here are some of his images, and they are very realistic. They are with a direct sense of light and shadow. They're made from direct observation. For the most part, he paints people doing things that he can observe. So he kind of covers all the bases, people playing music. This is people boating. This is an operating theater, and I'll show you one of those. And of course, a lot of portraits. So this is Max Schmidt in a single scull, which is a type of boat. And there's a clear light here that for me is reminiscent of Vermeer or of any of the Dutch painters from the Renaissance or the Baroque. There's kind of a clear light that illuminates things directly. Eakins is a masterful realist artist. This is Max Schmidt, who was a championship rower. And Eakins, the painter, is shown here in the background with his name on his boat and the date. So this sort of thing would be done from observation in part, but then constructed the rest of the way in the studio. Eakins is also one of the early artists to use the camera as a tool. So he used the photographs that he took of various things, including the models, the landscape, all of that, to construct his images the rest of the way in the studio. And this is the Gross Clinic, and not gross as in disgusting, although it may be in this case. But this is Dr. Samuel Gross, who is a very well-known surgeon during their time period. So this is what medical teaching looked like in the 1870s. This is an auditorium. There is an operating theater, and there is a patient on the operating table. I started to say a victim, but patient on the operating table. And these are students, some of them looking a little bit bored and others looking pretty fascinated, who are watching this operation take place. So that is how they learned to do surgery. And all the details are there. I mean, there's the blood on the hands and blood on the scalpel. There is the incision and blood dripping out. You even get the light on this guy's ear and on his hair, and then the patient's mother kind of recoiling in horror when she sees the details of what's going on with her son. This guy is taking notes on the whole thing, and there is Eakins here in the background. He puts himself in the act of drawing as kind of a self-portrait and nod to a lot of other artists who've done the same thing. So that is Eakins, and he's really influential in the way that he paints. It might just look like a regular painting to you today. That is because so many painters have followed in the wake of Thomas Eakins. And among his students are Henry Ossawa Tanner, Ossawa Tanner was a student of Eakins. He is the first African-American painter to get wide recognition. And Eakins also insisted on teaching people of all skin tones, all of that, which was unusual, even though it was the North. And after the Civil War, I mean, there's still a lot of racism in the United States. So Tanner is the first really well-known African-American painter. This is the banjo lesson. And there is kind of a direct sense of light here illuminating the background, which puts the subject matter, the figures in the front, kind of cast in the shadows with light coming in through the window. You have an old man teaching a child how to play music. And the banjo is today probably most commonly associated with bluegrass and hillbillies and that sort of thing. But originally it is an African instrument or an instrument with African roots. There are a couple of instruments from West Africa that are very similar to this. It's basically a gourd drum with an animal skin head stretched over it, and then a stick attached with strings. So the banjo is, best we can tell, developed in the United States, but it has very, very African roots. And of course, it's developed by African Americans in the United States. So this is the banjo lesson. And this would be called genre painting, just kind of scenes of everyday life. And then Edmonia Lewis, also from this time period and prominent in the United States, is the first female African American professional sculptor, and she is also Native American. She is African American and Native American. She sculpts Forever Free, which is here, and here she is beside her sculpture. Her sculpture. This sculpture is, of course, about emancipation, and she sculpts basically in the classical tradition. She's kind of a neoclassical sculptor. She sculpts in the most academic and traditional style of her day and is absolutely great at it. But of course, the topics that she chooses to tackle are personal to her and a lot of other people. So this is Slavery and Emancipation, and that is Edmonia Lewis. And then all the academic artists also tackle the grand old themes of history, because that's really kind of the be-all, end-all for academic painting. And this is Cleopatra, and it is a massive sculpture. It's huge. It tackles the death of Cleopatra in this case. And this sculpture went missing for a long time. It was eventually found in kind of like not a stockyard, but like a shipping facility outside, had been there for a long time. And it was kind of rediscovered and restored, and it's in a museum today. She was very, very well known during her lifetime, but the network that typically artists enjoy, if they do, right, of connections, gallery contacts, other artists, was not there for a woman of color in the late 1800s. So she eventually moves to Paris, which is much more forward-thinking and accepting of her and her art. But that is Edmonia Lewis, and she is really sort of a standout sculptor and prize-winning sculptor during her day. But of course, had an uphill climb in the 1800s as a Black female in the United States. And then John Singer Sargent is one of the most well-known American figure painters. And this is his painting of Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes. There's a photograph of Isaac Newton Phelps Stokes, of course, named after the more famous Isaac Newton. And you can buy it on a pillow, apparently. It's a pretty well-known painting. And notice how the guy's in the background, how she is in the foreground. The painting is really about her. He is literally kind of in her shadow as the light is cast. And this speaks to the increasing role of women in making things go socially. So women, of course, do not have the right to vote yet, but it's on its way. And women are with a newfound sort of gradual freedom, and this really sort of captures that. So not only does it capture the personality of these two people, but also it's a good example of the way changes are happening socially and culturally. And if you are a female, you want to be painted by John Singer Sargent because he's really, really good at painting women. Uh, the rule for portrait painting is always to flatter the sitter, right? To make people look good. And he does so in a way that doesn't seem to be overly flattering. It's just really kind of well observed, well thought out. He's a beautiful painter. And his painting technique is fairly loose, but it all goes in place. He definitely takes a page from Velázquez, from Rubens, from those sorts of painters, and he makes a great living painting wealthy people. And this is his Madame X, which was at one time scandalous. Does not seem like it today. Originally, this strap on her gown was hanging down here off her shoulder, which was thought to be very provocative. She was, as an individual, was well known in society. She was thought to be kind of a social climber, and a lot of people did not like her because she was not old money. She was someone who kind of made waves in her social environment. That is what the content was about originally. For us, it sticks out as a beautiful painting in which he kind of abstracts the form just a bit. I mean, of course, it looks real and it flatters the person, but look at the strong profile that is here. It's all about line, follows through there. The neck is all about line. And she is distinguished from this just plain dull brown background by relatively bright whites for skin tones, stark black for the dress, and you get the undulating curve of the arm, of the hand, of the wrist. All of this absolutely thoroughly well observed. The edge of the table, you can see here, is just kind of a rough brushstroke that just goes across through here. It puts a little more pressure, leaves a little more paint. That's all that's there, and it works very well as a highlight. Same thing for the legs of the table. They're just kind of squiggles of paint that put the lights and darks where they need to go, looking absolutely photographic from a distance. So it's a stark, striking composition for us today, kind of leaning towards line and abstraction. And he very much is indebted to painters like Velázquez. So that is John Singer Sargent. And then lastly, for the United States, and these are just, kind of the cream of the crop painters that stick out, painters and sculptors. Albert Bierstadt is a landscape painter, and this is his painting Rocky Mountains, Lander's Peak. He goes to out west. He paints what he sees. This is a painting of Native American encampment and way of life and a lake and a waterfall and the Rocky Mountains. And he paints pictures like these and he sends them back to DC and he says, look what is there. We need to preserve this. So his paintings are directly responsible for helping to create the national park because he paints such a stunning likeness of what is there that people want to make sure it stays, right? Because there are very few places like this on Earth. So that is Albert Bierstadt, and this is sort of the landscape painting of the United States, painting our unique landscape. And if you meet people from Europe, people from other places, if they're out west, they're always blown away by the landscape of the United States. There's so much of it, and it's so varied. All right, so that is in the United States. And then Impressionism. All right, so this is the big art movement that really changes the way paintings work. The Impressionists were interested in the effects of color. They were not so interested in politics, such as David and French Revolution. They're not really interested in religion in the way that a lot of painters throughout history had been. They were interested in art for art's sake. So the Impressionists are kind of in keeping with Edouard Manet's assertion that a good painting should be true to itself. Art for art's sake is not too far removed from that. They use broken color rather than flat. Manet tended to use very flat, broad sections of color. The Impressionists use little dots and dashes of color. And for the Impressionists, local color, which would be that an apple is red or green, depending on the kind of apple it is, and an orange is orange, that is altered by lighting effects. So if you drive into work at sunrise, there may be a red glow or orange glow all over everything, and that glow changes by noon, and then it changes again by evening. So the fields may appear to be red or orange because that's the light that's cast on them. That is optical color. That's what the Impressionists use. So lighting effects change the kind of proper color or expected color for things. And the Impressionists don't use black pigment. They use a mixture of their other colors to make a dark tone. So the shadows in Impressionist paintings are often purple or kind of greenish or gray. If you mix all your pigments together, you get a dark enough tone. And in real life, there is no color black. Black is the absence of light. So the shadows that you see in a room are not black shadows. They are, kind of all the other colors in the room with just less light there. The Impressionists are interested in light and color itself. And of course, color comes from light. They have read the work of Sir Isaac Newton, who investigates the way that light works to bring about color. And Claude Monet is the leader of the Impressionists, not to be confused with Edouard Manet with an A. So Monet is just one of several Impressionists, but he's kind of the most well-known, and he was a leader then. This is his Impression Sunrise from 1872. And it does not look too crazy, maybe. It just looks kind of loose. But in this time period, people did not expect a painting to look like this. If you squint, it kind of looks real. But it's squiggles, it's dots and dashes of color. And importantly for them, it's not about anything important. So it's not the crucifixion of Christ. It's not the coronation of a king. It's not some great battle from history. It's just boats in a harbor and the sun is coming up. So the Impressionists chose their subject matter based on what they found interesting and what was there for them to physically look at and paint. And they're really interested in light, so they tend to paint outdoors where the light is. So this is boats in a harbor. Two figures here. You can see their shadows broken by the ripples of the water. Here is the sun, and it's made with red and white and a bit of yellow, and it kind of makes this orangey pink. And then he has some of that same paint on his brush. You can see the white and the pink separating here, and he kind of lays it across not much more slowly than what I'm doing with the cursor. And that is where it goes. So it is broken color rather than flat color. And again, if you squint, it kind of looks real. He's investigating light. He picked the sunrise because light is what he's looking for. So people thought, that's not anything, right? That's not art, clearly. Especially, let me go back to Bouguereau. And this is what people thought art should look like. These are Bouguereau paintings. He painted nymphs and satyr. So if people are used to seeing paintings that look like this from the Academy, and instead they see this, it's absolutely apples and oranges. So this painting, believe it or not, when it was shown in 1872, was a minor scandal, and people thought, or at least one critic suggested, that pregnant women and small children not be in the room with this painting because it might be too upsetting for their constitution, right? It was shocking to them, as crazy as that seems to me today. But that's because this is what painting was supposed to look like to them, and that is clearly not that. And so that is Impression Sunrise. He also went to the cathedral near his house, and he painted it again and again and again and again and again. So Rouen Cathedral is not about the cathedral in any way. The cathedral is a convenient prop that does not move so that he can paint it. And this is 30 versions of Rouen Cathedral. Oh, I don't want that video. Back up here. You can see them here, just kind of lined up. You can see the variations in color and everything else. So these are not paintings of stone. They are paintings of the light that allow you to see the stone. And he doesn't so much get into architectural detail as he gets into light and shadow. So sometimes it's full sun and it's kind of bleached out. Sometimes it's cloudy and overcast and you get a hard shadow coming from one side. He goes to the cathedral at different times of the day. He paints what he sees. And like a scientist with a control, and some of these are really fairly abstracted. Like a scientist with a control, he has one thing that stays the same, and he has variations that revolve around that. The thing that stays the same for Monet is his subject matter. So he paints the cathedral about 30 times, and there are lots of variations within those. So as the light changes, his colors change. And then, of course, he's also known for his haystacks, and these are some of his haystack series. Hay is tan, right? Light brown. It's the color of dead grass. But when the light changes, it may appear to be different. So this has a lot of other color going in that is not there as far as local color goes, right? Which means that an orange is orange or hay is tan. This hay is green, a bit of blue, a bit of red, a bit of pink, white, some brown, all that. That is one Monet haystack painting. There's another one in winter, another one there with sunrise or sunset, another one there. These paintings are about the light itself, not about the haystacks. And they don't sell well, right? As you can imagine. I mean, we think that they're pretty great to look at today. But then people were like, why would you want a painting of a haystack? Because it's not the stuff that art is supposed to be about, not art with a capital A, culture with a capital C. So these are for him experiments. They are for him and for a handful of other painters who are up on what he's doing, right? The Impressionists. He is one of the first kind of starving artists as a generation. All of the Impressionists don't really make any money from their paintings until they are fairly old. So by the time he's in his 70s, Monet makes a living from his paintings, and that's pretty good. It takes up until that time period because what he's really painting, what he's experimenting with, is light itself. And it's not all haystacks and churches. This is also Monet. And he paints just simple scenes of people at the lake. Here is a woman in a boat and her hat. And it's a quick landscape. He has also learned from Velasquez that you can apply paint very rapidly. And by putting it in the right spot, be done with the painting a lot more quickly. So Monet and the other Impressionists might paint 3 pictures in a day. They might paint one in the morning, one at midday, one in the evening. The light would be different from each one. And he moves his brush fast because the light changes. So he has to get it in. It's not meant to be a masterwork like Las Meninas. It is meant to be a quick impression of what he sees before it goes away. And that is in part where Impressionism comes from, also from this painting, Impression Sunrise, which is kind of the first early impressionistic painting that is exhibited. And then there are others. There's Renoir. Renoir makes a decent living painting middle class and upper middle class and wealthy people. So they're still very wealthy people, of course, in Paris after the French Revolution. They're just not aristocrats, tend to be merchants. And Renoir is able to paint them for the most part, make a living, but he also paints scenes like this, Luncheon on the Boating Party. And this is one of his masterworks. This, again, is not anything important. It's kind of hard for us to tell, but to put it in cultural context, this is a casual Sunday afternoon. They're eating on a boat on the river. The guys with the hats and sleeveless shirts are boatmen who work there. These are just kind of like a motley assortment of bohemians, as they would have been thought of then, which really means you're from the Czech Republic. But when everybody says bohemian, they mean kind of free-thinking, that sort of thing. So this is a kind of motley group of people assembled. They are largely friends of the artist. These painters are poor. They hang out with other poor people, with people who are kind of on the edge of society oftentimes. This lady has a dog on the table, so it's very casual and laid back. There is wine and grapes and cheeses and breads and things like that laid out. And it's not about anything important. It's just probably a Sunday afternoon. They're out for a boat ride. It is casual daily life, which was not considered stuff for important art. And that's why the Impressionists are painting it, right? The stakes are less because they're not tackling big themes. They are tackling everyday subject matter because what they're really painting about is paint itself, right? They're experimenting in the way that they paint. So the main thing the Impressionist and all modernism going forward is interested in is form. They can pick subject matter that does not matter because the paintings are not about the people that are in them typically, they're about the way that they are painted. And I can't zoom in on this one, but those are just kind of loose brushstrokes of color to get the plant life in the background. The shift with Impressionism goes from what is that a painting of to the style of paint applied to the canvas itself. And that's the fundamental thing with Impressionism. And then there's Camille Pissarro, bit of a landscape, a path at the Hermitage. And you can see in this one, very, very loose painting. He is trying to lay things down and get it there before the light changes. So a lot of landscape, just views of nature, not about anything overly important. And then the Impressionists are the first group of artists as a whole that openly embrace females as members of their kind of fledgling art movement as it was back in the day. So Berthe Morisot is one of the well-known female Impressionist painters. And again, you have people on a boat. This is how they dressed back in the day for going out on an afternoon. And it's really, really loose and brushy. And zooming in just a little bit, you can see loose, wet brushstrokes. These are ducks or geese. Can't tell, but waterfowl. And sometimes the faces are solid enough, but the rest of it just totally dissolves into brushstrokes. They're just putting the paint down to capture the light where it is. So her jacket here is made up of highlight on top, shadow underneath, that sort of thing. Notice there's very little really, really dark. That's a super dark blue, probably mixed with a bit of brown to get that almost black that is there. The reason they don't use black is not just from a conceptual standpoint that there's no black light in nature. It's that black really jumps out if you put it into a painting like this. It works better if the shadows are gray or kind of muted purples and blues and browns and things like that. So this is Berthe Morisot. And then Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt trained extensively with Degas, and Degas began as an academic painter. So she has an academic background, which you can see in the solidity of her figures. She paints in a fairly traditional way, but there is that expressive use of color. You can see it here in the wallpaper in the background. You can see it in the application of paint here. A lot of blue highlights and shadows. And of course, she paints things that are interesting to her, such as relationships of mothers to children and things like that. So from male to female painters, you have different interests as far as subject matter goes. The female painters throughout art history are more likely to concentrate on images of motherhood, right, as you might expect, than the male painters are. So we get different points of view from female painters. And you can see here the blue highlights. There are blue shadows. This is a painting that is thoroughly impressionist, but is more on the realistic end of that. And her drawing skills are absolutely spot on. And then late Monet, near the end of his life, is more experimental. He moves past just looking at light that he can see, and he starts to think, well, what else can I push it towards? So this is more experimental. It is based on observation, but then he takes it to the studio and he finishes it there, finishing it up so that it is in the end the way that he wants it, not necessarily the way that he actually saw it. So through his experiments, he learns a lot, and he's been able to use that to make his own new style of painting. And late Monet takes a lot of liberties with color, as you can see here. It is all brushstrokes. It is all broken color, purple shadows. Everything is diffused light, a place that painting had not gone to before Monet and his experiments. So if there's a Monet show at the High Museum next year, it's probably going to sell out opening week. But during his lifetime, his paintings did not sell well because they were weird and nobody knew what to think about them, right? Who cared about haystacks? So it was a gradual sort of uphill climb. But the Impressionists are the first group of modern artists, modern with a capital M, that really make paintings that don't look anything like what came before. And that's a pretty good stopping point for that. Any questions on anything so far? All right. So if you do, shout them out or type them in. All right. So the next section is chapter 18, part 2, and it's just how I have it divided up. But it is the post-impressionist, and they are, as you might expect, the artists that come after impressionism, sort of follow in their wake. So there are several. We'll concentrate on just a handful of them, and I will put up some short videos on YouTube that you can watch at your leisure about the post-impressionist. And these are artists who are more experimental. They build on what was developed by Monet and Renoir and the other impressionists, and they kind of push it forward further into abstraction and expression. There are artists like Vincent van Gogh and George Seurat, and that will be it for today. So if you guys don't have any other questions, then I guess that is it. Let me make sure before you go. I'll make sure I know who is here. Okay. Yeah, looks like that is everybody. Everybody is in attendance. I appreciate that. And okay, so that is that. And you guys have a great rest of the morning.